Hello, everyone. It's good to see everybody here. I am with Dr. Tony Barber, A.W. Barber, and Dr. Timothy Harvey. And I just want to, before we get into this wonderful, amazing book that they just released, I'm just going to give a little introduction to these amazing men. And I'll just read something here. Actually, it's from the back of our book, this new book that you'll be hearing about today. And I'll just read it here for you. So A.W. Barber is an associate professor researching in Buddhist culture and director of Asian studies at the University of Calgary. He is the author of Syncretizing Buddhism by Vogenstein Press, editor of the 72-volume Tibetan Tripitaka, Taipei edition, a co-editor of Buddhism Along the Krishna River Valley of Andhra, and 95 chapters, articles, public lectures, and other miscellaneous things. And we also have with us today Dr. Timothy Harvey, and he is an associate professor of philosophy and ethics, and program coordinator of social justice and Catholic studies at St. Mary's University, Calgary. He's the author of Jürgen Moltmann's Ethics of Hope, Eschatological Possibilities for Moral Action, Ashgate Routledge, and co-editor of Encountering Earth, Thinking Theologically with a More Than Human World by Cascade. He has also authored numerous academic articles and book chapters. His research interests explore the intersections of eco-theology, animal studies, public theology, and political praxis. So thank you again, both of you, being here for, in some ways, sort of our Zoom book launch. I don't know if we want to call it that, but it's very exciting. For those watching, please watch to the end. It's going to be very, very exciting, the different things we're going to go into. So as our wonderful authors are going to tell you, this book has just come out, and I know because it's in Zoom, it's going to look like we're in a mirror. So it's the title is Christian Buddhist Conversations, Foundations for Dialogue by both of them. And to sort of launch into some of the concepts in the book, I just wanted to ask you an initial question, if you can both answer on this. Why do you think Catholicism, Christianity, and Buddhism have such a long monastic heritage? And you get into this in the book.
Tim, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, I think there's two ways to think about this question. One is the historical, and then one is in terms of the spiritual practice itself. I think the unique historical location for the beginnings of monastic practice in each religious tradition is different in that it depends on their own unique circumstance. I can speak for Christianity, where after the time of the martyrs and when Christianity became more welcomed in the Roman Empire under Constantine, then became the official religion under Theodosius, Christians were left wondering, how can we have the same kind of intensity of piety and spiritual practice that was exemplified in the martyrs? How can we live the same kind of Christ-like sacrifice? And it was out of this that the early desert mothers and fathers began leaving urban centers to kind of shrug off the things of this world, what we're seeing as the moral compromises as from the urban centers and whatnot. And this eventually formed groups around unique individuals like St. Anthony and others, until eventually they formed communes and groups that would form rules, like the rule of St. Benedict, for example. And so, first of all, it starts out of the particular historical communities that are grappling with their own situation, their own needs and desires to live a faithful life. But in terms of the spiritual practice itself, I think that there's much about meditative, contemplative practice that we can see across traditions as well. And while the actual practices may differ, there is something about humans connecting with themselves, with something beyond themselves. There's something about slowing down. Even the more we're learning about the biology of contemplation, even something about slowing down our body, something about the inward turn that speaks to the human condition across traditions. And I think that this really speaks to how such a long-standing and diverse contemplative and monastic practices can arise in different traditions with quite different historical locations.
Oh, well, that was very good. I think in India, it seems to me that there was probably two driving forces behind the early monasticism. The first is, I think a lot of people know, in Hinduism, the priests, the Brahmins, are married. And they had to make, their way in life just like any other person, right? And so, of course, early on, it was primarily agricultural, but later, they had to make money. And, they had to survive and support their families and so on. And so a number of groups, Buddhists were one of them, looked at this and said, we just don't want that. We want to be able to stay very focused on our spiritual practices. And by the time of the Buddha, there was already a tradition of these begging holy men, right? And their way of surviving was just, going door to door and people putting food in a bowl. And so I think that was part of the driving force, was to just limit how much, you're connected with regular everyday life so that you could focus on the spiritual life. But I think the second driving force behind this was basically education. India, for most of the period of time before the current era, held that scriptures should not be written down. And so the Vedas were not written down, the Upanishads were not written down. And when Buddhism came along, they didn't write down their teachings either, which meant that you had to have people spending years memorizing texts, right? And so the disciples would sit at the feet of the masters, and the masters would recite, and then the students would copy it until they could recite, right, verbatim. And this actually still goes on in the Buddhist world. Tibetan education, traditional Tibetan education, requires the monks to memorize quite a few texts, right? And eventually, of course, everything does get written down. Thank goodness for those of us who are a little more limited in our memories. Right? But so I mean, if you're going to have people, sitting around for long hours every day, just reciting, trying to keep the tradition alive through memory, they're not going to have much time for farming and raising cattle or whatever most people do. So I think those are really kind of the two driving forces behind the early period of monasticism.
For both traditions here, is there an idea, kind of this idea you're sort of coming out of the world into a different state, if you will, and kind of being different than everyone, and through the kind of the practice of monasticism, that you're maybe advancing sort of ahead of the world or beside it or something like that, if you know what I mean?
Maybe I'll go. Yeah, that's true. Clearly the case in Buddhism, and actually it became a very controversial point as Buddhism spread out of India into China, right? So in India, a Buddhist monk or someone from another religion who had renounced the world was actually put up on high and bowed to and respected even by the kings, right? Because it was seen that they had that ability to give up what everybody else is connected with, right? When Buddhism got to China, the Chinese idea was absolutely everything is beneath the emperor, right? And so Buddhist monks were saying, well, you're just an emperor, right? So, right? And the imperial forces were saying, no, you got to bow to the emperor. Everything's under him, right? And so it became a real controversy that had to be, worked out.
I think for the case of Christianity, it might be a little bit different. I think certainly in some instances, a notion of perhaps leaving the world or seeking something beyond the world. I think that's certainly true of the early desert hermits. But it depends on the charism of the monastic order. It depends on the particular gift or mission of the monastic order. So you have St. Francis, for example, whose mission and his own particular gifting, his own charism, was to actually be grounded in the world and the suffering of poverty and nature, right? It wasn't a beyond, but it was discovering where Christ is located within the world, particularly among those who suffer, among our fellow animals, and even with, as Pope Francis has reminded us, even cosmological realities with brother, sun, and sister moon. So, and then you have those who are dedicated more to teaching, to mission, so the Dominicans, the Jesuits, but you also still have those who are dedicated to a quiet, prayerful, contemplative life that's not meant to necessarily escape from the world, but to hold it up. So I think of perhaps the Cistercians who live a life of labor and of prayer. But there is certainly an element where locating oneself outside of the mundane concerns allows one to devote oneself to God in a particular way, obviously. But escapism, while it has featured in the history of Christianity, and continues to in various Christian communities, isn't necessarily endemic to Christian monasticism itself.
Okay. Thank you both. So on to our next question here. What do you think, because you talk about the sort of elements of shared history within Buddhism and in Christianity. So how does maybe somewhat of a shared history around monasticism, but also in other ways too, what does it mean for our future in working together, Buddhists and Christians, for the betterment of humanity? Maybe it's a little broader question here.
I can begin with this. I think we broached this in some of the latter portions of the book when we're talking about the place of the human within the world and cosmos, when we talk about public and even political action. I think we are, in each tradition, there are strong moves towards love and compassion on the one hand, also moves towards being peace builders and peacemakers. And I think that this sort of move, asking people to put aside conflict, asking people to put aside kind of selfishness or oppression, is a shared tradition. We can join forces in these kinds of endeavors. We can also, I think, learn from one another in terms of how we appreciate our fellow human beings, how we appreciate even members of the broader community of creation, as a Christian might say. And so I think that, partnering together in these kinds of unified movements are where all people of good faith, all people of goodwill, as the Catholic social tradition says, where all people of goodwill can come together and work towards the well-being of our common shared humanity and in our common home.
Well, I think when I look at the history on a very broad scale, I find that there's actually no society that existed without having religion. Whether we're looking at the early Greek states, like worshiping Athena at Athens, or in India, or China, Japan, they all have some type of religion, also have some type of of spirituality that is essential to the formation of that society. And I think these spiritual traditions or religions, they call us to be greater than ourselves, and to be greater than ourselves through some sort of discipline, whether it's the meditative tradition or the prayer tradition, or whether it's an active tradition of giving and helping, like we find in Mahayana Buddhism. They're all calling us to be greater through some sort of discipline. The secular state calls us to be political, and that's a very different call. As Tim mentioned, the religions call us to go beyond politics, to go beyond the conflict, right? To see the basic humanity in terms of human, but also to incorporate the animal world into our thinking as well, because it is kind of a, we're all on the same little piece of rock floating through space, so we have to take care of everything, not just ourselves. So for me, I think that's really what's important, and then that's where we can really start to build on things between Christians and Catholics and Buddhists and Hindus and Jews and others.
There's that popular saying that you don't discuss politics, religion in polite company. And I think all that's really left us with our societies that don't know how to talk about these things, though. And the role that religions have in our world is so central, and yet there's really fundamental misunderstandings about what different religious traditions believe, what is shared, what is unique and special, and what we can learn from each other. And so I think any effort just to learn about these things is a part of what it means to be a citizen of the world.
I think part of the problem was, with the European Enlightenment, religion was seen as being primarily mythic and superstitious, right? But in the Buddhist tradition, all the way back to the Buddha, he said, logic and putting things into the light of reason, right, was all good and fine, but it's limited. It can't take you everywhere. It can only take you so far. And it seems in the modern world, maybe we need to revisit this type of an idea that these methods that we have developed in the Enlightenment and what followed the Enlightenment are very powerful and very, if used correctly, very good for society and for the environment. But if we put our faith in these, it will eventually lead to a dead end. We have to look beyond where those tools can get us to understand things in a much broader sense that is also more focused on sort of being, right, on humanity, on these characteristics.
As you both talk here, I'm kind of reminded of an interpretation of George Friedrich Hegel that everything is political in the modern world. But maybe to build off of this idea too, at least kind of in my master's, that one of the things that was very prominent is this idea of sort of being anti-metaphysical. And in some ways, it's almost like they wanted to get rid of metaphysics, sort of to define that for people. This idea that, of course, that there are like real substantive realities, whether that's spiritual or physical realities or however different ways that Western philosophy sometimes identifies things, but to get rid of metaphysics and to just have ethics. And so this idea that there's just this perfect kind of field of ethics, and get rid of all the sort of the stuff around it, but just be like, just focus on that. So maybe if you can build off of that idea, and kind of Buddhism and Christianity's response to that.
There's some of the early discussions about the Buddha from the late 1800s rather made him out to be like a good British chap that you could sit down and have a cup of tea with and talk ethics. And so I think he was maybe a little bit more than just a nice afternoon of tea and conversation. Tim, maybe you can do something a little more substantive.
Well, no, I mean, that's quite funny, because when you said that, Tony, I was thinking of several 19th century German authors who did the same thing with Jesus. So this is quite funny. But in the West, there's a long-standing philosophical tradition where epistemology and metaphysics, or epistemology and ontology. So epistemology, how do we know? Ontology, what are essences, or how do we describe substances of things? What is the nature of the world? Metaphysics, where they need each other, but they also run at cross directions. So we discover kind of metaphysics through an epistemology that begins with finitude. This was Aristotle's move. But finitude becomes defined only vis-a-vis infinitude, right? That which is beyond the limits within which we work and live and normally. So epistemologically, we're moving in one direction, but we discover that the reality of it was always moving in the other. And it seems that we've held on to the epistemology, but we've forgotten the other end of it. And so now we're only thinking about the one-way traffic rather than realizing we're moving in both directions here. And so this play on the notion of recognizing our own finitude, and even in a person's life, we all have our finite limits, but we also are able to transcend them, where we move beyond the limitations of our immediate experience to discover new things, to learn. Education is a transcendent experience in the sense that you are moving beyond the boundaries of your experience. So if this move to transcend a finite limit is possible, from Aristotle and the Neoplatonics onward, and you get this in the medieval Islamic philosophers as well, like Averroes and Avicenna, you can epistemologically extend this to contemplate realities that move beyond metaphysics. And I always find it odd, because the claim to disavow metaphysics, in a way, is its own metaphysics. It's just the metaphysics of naturalism. But that has become the dominant metaphysics, or logical positivism. So I think that if we think about the kinds of cultural and historical and intellectual moves that we're making, there's certainly things that religion can offer us because there's long traditions of trying to think through these issues, of trying to enact them in practices and in lives that are very important and have given unique insights into the human condition.
So maybe this is a good bridge into, oh, Tony, did you want to say something there? Sorry.
Well, I wanted to add an example from Buddhism. I think it helps support what Tim was saying. In Buddhism, there's this idea of, say there's this river, right? And if you're a hell being, the river is a river of blood and pus and all sorts of disgusting things. If you're an animal or a human, the river is a river of nice, pure, clean water, very enjoyable. And if you're a god, the river is a river of ambrosia. Right? So it's the same river, right? And it's your framework. It's your mentality. It's your epistemological stance that is going to determine what you're experiencing. And I think what these traditions do, the Buddhist, Christian, especially the contemplative traditions, what they do is they try to make us more sensitive. And in this way, it opens up your limitations. It starts to take the kind of the blinders, off of your vision of the river.
That's very interesting. So maybe that's a good bridge into our next question here. Based on your experience of writing together, what do you see as strengths and weaknesses in interreligious conversation in North America and around the world?
Well, maybe I'll start then. Thanks, Tim. It's we really live in an age of miracles. We have books, like the one that Tim and I just produced, videos like we're making right now, all sorts of other medias. And so it makes dialogue very easy to do, right? And not only easy to do in one locale, but, it can go out across the world in seconds. Secondarily, this also makes the world a very small place, right? And it was already before all this media was developed in the last 10, 15 years. The world was already a fairly small place. You could get on an airplane anywhere and be in the Far East in a matter of hours. So because it's a small place, dialogue has become extremely important. If we're going to get along with each other, if we're going to have a sustainable future, we have to be able to talk, and we have to be able to talk about something more than the superficial stuff that, pop stars and Hollywood movies and all this type of stuff. Not there's anything wrong with any of that, but the conversation has to be more because we are more. We're called to have a conversation with each other to try to really understand at a much deeper level. And we now have the technology to be able to do that on a global scale. But we lack the practice in the dialogue between each others that is open and accepting enough to kind of come together without having all sorts of agendas in the background of what you're trying to accomplish. And it's the agendas that make it very difficult for understanding, real understanding amongst people. And then for seeing, in our book, I think Tim and I have done a very good job at pointing out, there are real differences that need to be understood, but at the same time, there's also real similarities that need to be understood. And you can't understand similarities if you don't understand the differences. Right? And so it calls us to dialogue and to take things at a much more serious level than I think has previously been able to be accomplished.
Yeah, wow, thank you, Tony. That was lovely. Yeah, I mean, I really would like just to echo that. I think that one of the great ironies of our technological capacities today to talk across a globe is that we've actually become increasingly tribalized. And with that is often an accompanying suspicion of others. And this suspicion then keeps us from listening. It keeps us from desiring to know, desiring to learn, and viewing. We no longer view newness and difference as enriching. We view it as a threat or as false and something that needs to be condemned. And what I hope and I think we've really accomplished in this book is the richness of dialogue is itself its own end in some ways, where this is what it means to have a shared humanity. Tony earlier referred to the reality that we're all sharing a life on this rock. And what kind of a life will it be? Will it be a life where we learn, where we have patience and openness, generosity of spirit and kindness? Or is it a world where we merely enter into our echo chambers and we view others suspiciously? And the rhetoric that comes out of our lips is consistently condemnatory rather than charitable. And so I think that recognizing difference and similarity, as Tony was saying, is a part of this, and recognizing that richness is not only to be found in similarity, richness is also to be found, and perhaps even more so, in difference.
Thank you both. So maybe we might launch into kind of a little bit more direct question in some ways here. From your book, you signaled the important similarities and differences between Jesus Christ and the Buddha. And can you talk about this more?
Well, from my perspective, one of the key differences is how the Christian understanding of Christ developed, especially over the first few centuries, where Christ was recognized as both fully divine and fully human, where notions of the Trinity became more developed and refined, and there was an increasing recognition of the deep connection between the experience of Jesus of Nazareth and the encounter with God that occurred within that experience. And this came to be recognized as Christ as the second person of the Trinity, as the Son of God in this divine sense. And the Buddha, and Tony can speak to this, that has there's a different understanding there. And yet, both are seen as teachers, both are seen as creating and instantiating a way of life that is fruitful, that opens people's spiritual capacities as well. And so this is, I think, a good example of one of these difference and yet points of connection that we can articulate.
It seems to me that one of the problems that has happened with dialogue, and why I was very keen on the project of co-writing this book, was that there's a lot of material out there that is fundamentally misunderstood the connections between these two figures. Right? Where they have gone wrong is primarily looking at history. Right? So Jesus did this thing, he went into the desert, and the Buddha, and trying to look at these things in a sort of a historical type of way, and then connect it back to some sort of religious point. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it. They're coming out of very different social settings. They're 500 years apart from each other. They're the whole kind of framework that the story of Jesus's life and Buddha's life is really quite different. But when we get past that, when we start looking at the spiritual side of things, when we start looking at the symbolic side of things, as Tim was alluding to, that's where we start to see them, some comparisons that are profitable to explore. And so I was hoping that with the publication of this book, that some of those problems could be set to rest, because we have two authors working from within their own tradition in dialogue with each other, instead of one person from one tradition writing about the other tradition. And at the same time, then open up new doors where more fruitful comparisons and contrasts can be had to further the dialogue.
I'm kind of thinking about how, and this is not so much definitely, I mean, it is a theme, but it if you can talk about maybe in both of them, kind of the idea of liberation or freedom from error, how to sort of how the moral code of both, how is that similar and different as sort of freedom from the world, and kind of maybe alluding to our monastic thing we got into the other, I guess about 20, 30 minutes ago.
Why don't you begin, Tony?
Oh, thank you. The liberation in Buddhism is understood to be a very spiritual type of thing that allows you freedom from all sorts of constraints, including certain ethical constraints. Because at least the dialogue within in Buddhism about ethics is that it's basically intentional. Right? So committing suicide in Buddhism is unacceptable. But a soldier throwing himself on a hand grenade to protect the fellows in the foxhole that he's with, it's suicide. But that's really acceptable. That's an incredible sacrifice that's made. Right? So it's the intention behind things that that drive whether a particular act is ethical or unethical. Right? And the same thing, even the monastic tradition. There's lots of texts in Buddhism that are very critical of the monastic tradition within Buddhism, saying, if people are joining, because they're going to get a free meal and a free place to stay, that's all the wrong reasons, right? If you're going to really dedicate yourself to the path, that's well and fine, But if you're just, trying to glide through life, right? So, right, the intention is quite important. But that's, this is part of calling us to be greater than ourselves. Right? If we all, we're all have this, if I can say, animal side. We want to be comfortable. We want to have everything easy. We want whatever we want when we want it. And ethics in itself is calling us to say, okay, maybe I'll discomfort myself for the sake of somebody else, or for the, I'll do something that's putting me way out for the sake of saving this animal or whatever the case might be. And that's what makes us better than ourselves. Right? It's very easy to be selfish and self-centered. Extremely simple for humans to do that. You can, well, maybe not this year because this is an unusual year, but most years I get the biggest charge out of this. If you go to the mall around Christmas time, right? Christmas is all about giving and loving and all these wonderful ideas, and then people are ready to kill each other to get another sale or to get the parking spot at the mall. Right? And it's just like, I think you kind of missed the boat here, So maybe not this year because of the conditions we find ourselves in, COVID. But
maybe they're rushing to get Amazon sales. They'll block somebody else, or mass times or something. They wait
right.
up at 1 o'clock in the morning and book all the mass times so you can come into the church.
Yeah, it might not be Christmas without all that type of an aggravation. I don't know. So from my point of view, I think these are the important things. The more we can do, even it's a little thing. I tell people all the time, right? You work in an office, whatever company or bank or it doesn't matter, and you're walking down the hall and you see there's a piece of paper on the floor there. It's just garbage. Right? You can pick it up and put it in the garbage can, and then the caretaker doesn't have to. So you saved her or him, the bending over of their back, which they probably do, hundreds of times every night while they're cleaning your office. Right? So it's nothing, pick a piece of paper, it's nothing, but it's a great thing.
Yeah, and the point of liberation, I mean, there's in Christianity, there's the individual and the communal and the structural as well. You know, and I think of the biblical book of Galatians that St. Paul wrote that's in the New Testament. And he talks about the notion of freedom, freedom from external constraints, from having to live up to a particular set of categories or rules. And this is similar to what Tony was saying. But then also, this isn't uh, a freedom in the sense of freedom apart from others. This is a freedom in community always. And so this is why the fruit of the spiritual life, the fruits of the spirit, as Paul says, are, love, joy, peace, generosity, all of these things that are essentially communal and relational virtues. And so what we really discover is that being free is to be free for others, right? That's where genuine freedom lies, not to be an isolated monad, but to be in relationship with others. Jesus tells this story of it's well known, and he concludes by saying, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me." For people who are in prison, people who are in poverty, people who are alone. He talks about this in Matthew 25, and in that parable, at least, that's the criteria for individual destinies in that particular parable. How we treat those who are in the greatest need, how we engage and live with others. And we're also, liberated from the kinds of really constraints of self-aggrandizement as well. Tony alluded to that as well. I think of Thomas à Kempis, the medieval spiritual writer, and he had this phrase that is very difficult for most of us. I noticed for me, he says, "Love to be unknown." And this is an odd thing to quote when we're going to be sending out this video with our faces, and yet this kind of self-aggrandizement, this selfishness is just as much a prison as it is anything else, because you can never escape yourself, and if that becomes the one defining feature of your life, and that is just as much a prison as it is an open field to run free.
There's in Buddhism, liberation comes from wisdom, and there's a whole class of literature called the perfection of wisdom. The first book ever printed in history is the Buddhist book called the perfection of wisdom of the Diamond Sutra. And basically what that text says is that the perfection of wisdom is giving, but not just giving without an idea that there's a self who's giving. So it very much connects with what Tim was just saying.
As you both sort of talk about here, I'm kind of thinking, there's a medieval theologian, Peter Lombard, and he calls it the glory of paradox. And he's referring to something else, but I'm just sort of like thinking, again, Jesus says, let your light shine before everyone so that everyone sees your good works in heaven and praises your Father. But then, I mean, you look at Christmas and the fact that when Jesus and Mary and Joseph are in this unknown town, and it's just, no room for them at the end and things like that. So it's an interesting paradox in some ways. But so maybe to launch into another question here, what were some surprising things you both learned about each other and each other's religion while writing the book?
If I might start then, each other. I really appreciate Tim. I know he had a lot of things that were going on for him over the period of the few years that we worked on this together. And sometimes he was immensely productive, and sometimes he was quite slow and whatnot. But he kind of battled through it all, and I really appreciate that, because I think a lot of other people would have have given up along the way, just because it's difficult to have a large project and see it, all the way through, because so many things happen in life that act to try to prevent the conclusion coming about. On an intellectual scale, it was very enlightening for me. I'm not a religious scholar. My degree is in Buddhist studies, and I approach things pretty much through a cultural framework, linguistics, and so on. So, although when I was younger, I had read Aquinas, I had read Augustine, I really did not know much about any of the later Christian writers like Calvin or Martin Luther or Ignatius, Saint Ignatius, and these individuals. So I found it really, really quite interesting to read Tim's compositions on these particular topics that the book is divided into, and see what all these different people had to say. It's coming out of a very different, intellectual tradition. It's coming out of a very different set of preliminary thoughts that were developed, but it is quite intellectually challenging, both for me because some of the lingo was not familiar, and so good thing there's Google. I could look up. I've never seen that word before. What the heck is? But also quite rewarding to try to view things from a very different perspective than what you're used to working with.
Yes, and I want to echo. I mean, I appreciate Tony so much, and he is an immensely patient individual with me in the times of production and then the times of slowness. Kind of battling through some health issues and some other things. But his dedication and his patience, Tony is just actually, he's an amazing, incredible scholar, but he's really just a lovely and wonderful person that I enjoy greatly and greatly appreciate. And so this was actually a real joy to write this book with him. Over the years that we were doing this, and I learned so much. I had only an extremely rudimentary understanding of Buddhism. It was out of my framework, and again, I found it just so enriching to learn a history, a culture, a grammar that's fundamentally different, and yet so much is there. One of the metaphors that stands out to me in the book that Tony used, and I still think about it all the time when he's discussing the notion of karma, and he uses the notion of planting seeds, putting seeds out, and how this kind of grows and bears fruit, and this image. It was so non-retributive, in the colloquial senses. When somebody unfamiliar with Buddhism talks about karma, it's often like highly retributive, right? Like you do X and X will happen to you. When really it's about, something fundamentally different. And, I invite Tony to maybe speak more about it. But I mean, it was like every chapter, I was learning and gaining insights and gaining new metaphors, new ways of thinking about things to learn about Buddhism that I found to be really compelling and wonderful.
Well, thank you, Tim. That's very kind of you.
So maybe to sort of conclude us here, because we're coming up, I think, on our hour, or we might be slightly over here. Any final thoughts or anything else? And of course, just to plug the wonderful book again. And I think you can both tell us where we can get it as well too. But if you can kind of finish with final thoughts, anything else you wanted to say, and maybe give us a few more details of how to get a copy of the book.
You can, I'll at the end when we sign off here, I'll put up an image that has the book cover and web addresses of things that viewers might want to find interesting. But basically, the book, you can get an e-copy or a hard copy at Amazon, or you can go to the publisher's press page, Vogelstein Press, one word, vogelsteinpress.com, and you'll see the information there. They also have a example of a chapter. I think they use the introduction for that, table of contents and information about Tim and myself.
Yeah, and if I'll just close by saying, you know, there's something centrally important in a divided world about people talking in a way that's generous, caring, and foremost seeking to learn from one another. And that necessitates listening. It necessitates a posture of humility. I think it requires us to cast aside the agendas with which we come into conversations, and just have an openness to others as we encounter them. And that has been my experience of Tony over the last several years. And I hope that this book exemplifies that for people so that they can learn something more and something new about not just their own tradition, but a wonderful tradition that is new to them.
Well, thank you both again. And I actually didn't introduce myself in the beginning. I'm Father Adrian Martins. I'm a member of the Calgary Interfaith Council. And I'm here, I think you are both in your homes, if I'm presuming correctly here. But Tony, I think, looks like he's somewhere in Asia, but am I right there of the attribution?
This is the great Buddha in Nara, Japan.
Okay, there we are. I should know this. I lived in Japan. And I think I even went there once upon a time. So
it's a beautiful city to visit.
yes. Well, thank you both again. I really appreciate it. And yeah, and I think also too, you can do a search here for both of Tony and Tim here. And if you have any other further questions, you can contact them personally, if that's okay to say for both of you here. Yeah, so Tim is at currently at St. Mary's University, Calgary, and Dr. Tony Barber, A.W. Barber, is at the University of Calgary. So if I am correct there. All right.
I'd like to thank you, Father, for being the monitor and the hosting of this interview. I think it's very important that people become aware of these activities that are going on, even in times of great limitations.
Thank you, Tom.
Yes, thank you, Father Adrian.
Thank you, Tim. All right, well, everyone have a great day. And I think, Tony, you're going to put up that screen and we'll broadcast it to people for maybe a few seconds so they can catch it. And then we'll end our Zoom call.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Should be up there now.
Perfect.
Okay. Have a good afternoon, Tim. Have a good afternoon.